Bioneers, it's my people. This is where I feel it's the birthplace. It really is a joining of the midwives, the ideas, the ingenuity, the creativity, the sparks of inspiration. Bioneers brings all of these visions and all of this action together.
There's nothing that's off the table here. It's all possible, and it's all connected, and it's so liberating.
Welcome to Free Speech TV. My name is Carl Nagin, and I'm here with our Free Speech TV's ongoing coverage of the 2019 Bioneers Conference. My guest today is Greg Watson, and Greg Watson is a systems thinker who has been working on the problem of the climate crisis, global warming, both at the micro and macro level. He's done that beginning way back in 1978, perhaps even before, when he organized a network of urban farmers markets in the greater Boston metropolitan area at a time when Massachusetts as a state was importing about 90% of its food. Think about that, 90% of its food coming from California and far away. He is currently Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and one of his roles there is to direct something called Buckminster Fuller's World Game Workshop. So he's going to talk to us both about urban farming and also about ways we need to think about the climate crisis. Welcome to Free Speech TV, Greg. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Tell me, just give us a little bit of your personal trajectory and how you became involved in the 70s or even earlier with thinking about the climate crisis and the work that you've done.
Yeah, it was first actually the environmental, overall environmental crisis. And I tell people one of the reasons I did because I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, on the banks of Lake Erie and the Cuyahoga River. Two badly polluted bodies of water. The Cuyahoga, as you know, the surface would burst into flames every once in a while because it was so heavily polluted with chemicals. And that made me realize that even though I lived in the city, I had to be concerned about the environment. And that was right around the times of the first Earth Day, and came out, I left Cleveland to go to school on the East Coast, and just got immersed in the environmental movement. Saw that as very critical to the quality of life in urban areas.
So what role did Buckminster Fuller's thinking, how did that come into your intellectual understanding of how to think about environmental issues?
Well, it's a good question. I actually, once I got to Tufts University from Cleveland and started becoming involved in environmental issues, I was called on the carpet by members of the Tufts chapter of the Afro-American Society. They could not understand how an African-American male was involved in the environment. And when I asked them, well, what's the problem? They said, well, listen to the slogans. No growth, limited growth. Where do we see our economic equality factoring into that? Many of them saw that as they said, it seems like us, it's a ploy to maintain the status quo. It was a conundrum. I didn't know, I had an intuitive feeling that economic equality and environmental quality were compatible, but I didn't have an intellectual response to it. And nothing in my formal schooling gave me any clues to how to approach it. And then I went underground, Whole Earth Catalog, and then I discovered Buckminster Fuller, and doing more with just the whole philosophy clicked. And it was sort of like it was the first time that I felt that somebody was saying the things that I had been thinking, and it literally changed my life.
So back in those days, thinking about the environment was very siloed. It was separate from social justice,
exactly,
separate from equity issues, separate from food, even health. So how did specifically, tell us how Buckminster Fuller's thinking, sometimes I wonder, what would he make of where we are right now? And how would he help us to understand what to do?
Well, I think, I would say that just thinking about this, Fuller basically, so taking his whole systems approach, said that nature is bound to determine, make humanity a success. And if we understood how the world actually works, in concepts like synergy, and he said synergy is ubiquitous, but most of us don't even understand. And he often uses an example, and that means, quality of whole systems unpredicted by the parts in isolation. And usually that means you get a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Hydrogen, oxygen, both gases in the atmosphere. Nothing in their individual properties gives a hint that if you combine them in the right proportion, 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen, you get water. Water is not even predictive, and it emerges. And what he said was, we've got to, as you think in whole systems, you first have to determine where you want to be, and then focus on the parts and how you get there. And then you will see solutions emerge, especially, and some of them are going to be unpredictable. And while it sounds theoretical, in practice, it really does make sense. And I even, to the point where the farmers markets, you mentioned in 1978, where we had some of the highest food prices in the country. Farmers were having a tough time making a living. Consumers were being were suffering with high prices. And here's the oldest system in the world: direct marketing. Right, bring the farmer into the city. You'd be surprised how difficult something as simple as that is to actually make happen. But once it did, stereotypes were broken down, partnerships were created. The markets became one of those wholes greater than the sum of its parts. When you think about it, I think right now, currently about 98% of the agricultural land in the United States is owned by whites. And many black, especially Southern blacks, were forced or tricked out of their land over the years, or didn't have access to the same sorts of subsidies and support the federal government offered farmers. And so slowly but surely, we were removed from the land. And now since most of us have become, or a lot of us have become urbanized, we are looking to how we can do a couple things. Not only become urban farmers and provide access to local food, but it's a much more practical way of providing open space, right? Because it's productive open space, and so we're finding, but it's also building entrepreneurial skills and a bunch of other things. But it is clearly a movement today.
That's terrific. You've also been involved in wind power. Can you talk about some of your work with that?
Yes. I was in 1999. I was hired as the first executive director of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust. That's when the state legislature in Massachusetts restructured the electric utilities, opened it up to competition, and they decided that we've got to at least try to create a more level playing field for renewables. So they created a fund, system benefit charge if you like the program, a tax if you didn't like it on your utility bill, but it would raise about $25 million a year. And as we were trying to figure out what role, we were a small state, Massachusetts, coastal state, we don't have oil, we don't have natural gas, we do have some sun, but we have short growing seasons. A professor at UMass named William Hieronymus, great name, was a naval engineer, became a wind energy engineer, and he determined that there's enough wind energy off the coast of New England to power the entire country, actually, and it was totally untapped. No one, and so the whole idea of putting wind turbines offshore, so my involvement was to actually help sort of pioneer the first efforts to develop offshore wind energy in the United States.
That's extraordinary. How's that program grown? It's
grown and around the world, and it's still somewhat stagnant in the United States as it keeps running. And this is an issue. And when we talk about, I know we're going to talk about some other issues, but as we're still running into sort of the NIMBY. I don't know if you can call it NIMBY.
Not in my backyard.
Yeah,
I remember that story when we talked about it at Bioneers a few years ago. One of the opponents of that was the Kennedy family.
Ted Kennedy.
Right.
And so I call it not in my back bay. Right? That's right. But
may he rest in peace.
May he rest in peace. But there are also fears. The fishing community who said it's tough. We're making it tough. Now all of a sudden you're going to put these structures out there. The problem is that we went through an arduous process, and we tried to address. We created stakeholder meetings. We brought engineers together with biologists, and they kind of worked it out. But it seems like every time a new project arises, we go back to square one again.
Right.
We don't take the lessons learned.
Is that a political bottleneck? How do you, as a systems thinker, stepping back from your engagement with it and your commitment to it, where's the bottleneck in that? Is it political? What is it?
I think it's partly political. I think it's partly a matter of communication, among other things. I think this is why what you're doing here is, and I mean, it's so important. And I think there's a much shorter attention span. People don't read, among other things. So we have to figure out, and they're overwhelmed by social media. So it's interesting. So when the opposition basically funded by one of the Koch brothers, had lots of money, they could do a lot of things on social media. And as we were a quasi-state agency, and we didn't really have that same kind of flexibility. And of course, we had to, adhere by certain. So I think they're just a lot. The opponents or the naysayers have a lot more resources, and if they're savvy, they can. And stalling, right? You don't have to stop. What you have to do is stall it long enough for the developer or whomever to say, I can't do this anymore.
His profits out.
Yeah, the developer at Cape Wind sunk something of north of $100 million, and never put one turbine in the water.
Oh my goodness! Oh my, that's a.
But around the world,
emblematic story.
But around the world, it's one of the fastest growing renewable technologies.
Extraordinary.
Yep.
You're someone who's worked both outside the system and inside the system, and you worked as commissioner, as I understand it, commissioner of agriculture within the state of Massachusetts.
That's correct.
Under 2 governorships.
Actually, under 3.
3. Ooh. You have been in the system.
I've been.
So tell me about that experience, because clearly these projects, these solutions are out there, but there are obstacles. And I'd like to hear about some of the things, the initiatives you did as Commissioner of Agriculture in Massachusetts, things that worked and how you made them work.
Well, there are obstacles, but there are also opportunities to build bridges. You have to understand, I was appointed by Michael Dukakis. I was working at a place called the New Alchemy Institute. Thank God. All right, we
out
were
of the system into the
we
system.
were organic. We were geodesic domes, wind turbine, and the current the commissioner right before me, Gus Schumacher, had to leave. He was on leave from the World Bank. He suggested that the governor appoint me, and the reason Gus did that is because he used to come to my farmers markets.
Wow.
And he said, well, this is fantastic. So he says, you got to get this guy.
Synergy.
Synergy. Before I would accept it, I called around. I called farmers. I called a longtime friend, former Commissioner Winthrop. The last call I made was to the Massachusetts Farm Bureau. And like I said, here's this black guy from Cleveland, Ohio, working at the New Alchemy Institute, and the governor is proposing appointing him Commissioner of Agriculture. So I talked to Gordon, the head of the Farm Bureau, and he paused and he said to me, all right, tell me, Greg, is this organic? Is this sustainable agriculture necessarily organic? And I said, Gordon, if we could show you how you could cut your inputs and cut your costs and not jeopardize your yields, would you be interested? He goes, every farmer would be interested in that.
Wow.
And so he said, we have to bridge this gap between the environmental community and the farming community. Looks like you could help us do that. So he said, I'm blessing you to come on.
Wow. So the first thing you did, even before you were in the office, was you were building a coalition.
Yeah. Yeah.
And reaching out to people that you might not want to, you would expect would oppose you.
Oppose me. And by the way, right after Michael Dukakis appointed me, he left to run for president, and there was an election, and Republican Bill Weld was elected. And so I didn't know if there was going to be, how long I was going to last after that.
Yeah. So tell me some of the initiatives you proposed, some of the work you did in that role that you feel was positive and had good outcomes.
And this is going to even sound a little mixed, but the first thing after that election, and then Bill Weld won, and I was sort of in this interim, right, in this limbo. I didn't know if he was going to reappoint me, but nonetheless, I was meeting with farmers because I'd just been appointed. The first group that asked me to come out and meet with them were the Massachusetts dairy farmers. Mm-hmm. They took me to a dairy farm. They didn't take me. They invited me to a dairy farm. I get there. They're all sitting around a picnic table, all Republicans, all white, John Deere caps pulled over their eyes, arms folded. And I sit down.
Watching dairy prices go down.
Watching dairy prices go down. I'm sitting opposite them. The first thing I'll never forget, Gordy Cook looks at me and says, Commissioner, what do you know about dairy? I said, how am I going to, I said, I'm going to answer truthfully. I said, nothing. And there was silence. And then he broke out in a big grin and he said, great, maybe you'll listen to us.
Wow.
And he said, here's our problem. We can't make it. The federal price for milk is below our cost of production. It's all based on the big farms out in the Midwest and California. We can't do it. We think we have a way that we can at least allow ourselves to break even on this. And they said, would you listen to what we're talking about? And so I did. It seemed to make sense. All the other secretaries and commissioners of agriculture on country, you don't touch dairy. Don't touch dairy. It was like, it's the subsidies and the
sacred cow.
We did it. It got tested all the way through Massachusetts courts. It passed. Farmers were doing okay, but then it got challenged, believe it or not, the U.S. Supreme Court.
Oh my goodness.
It went all the way to the Supreme Court. We lost. And that may sound like a failure, but what happened was even the dairy farmers said, for the first time, we were organized. Because we're solitary. Dairy farmers, we do our thing, but they could, and so they subsequently convinced the Massachusetts legislature to create a dairy stabilization fund.
So they created their own coalition. They found a treasure in a disaster.
And because they could see the synergy of organizing. And it wasn't that they didn't want to organize, it's just, it took a lot of extra work, and maybe they couldn't see the benefits of doing it. But they could see what happened as we organized, and the fact that we got all the way to the Supreme Court said, okay, that was a great effort.
Another instance of how things get siloed, groups get isolated, divide and conquer.
Absolutely. But the other successes were, well, at least certainly a clear success was establishing, I think, probably one of the country's first urban agriculture funding programs. So it's still going on. We issue grants, and you're never quite gone, right? Always, and to support the development of urban agriculture, and that is farms in the city. And because the mobilization was so I think strong and forceful, the mayor of Boston started a trend, which was sort of interesting. We went through a 2-year period rezoning the city of Boston for commercial farming.
Wow.
So he says, if it's not in the zoning code, it means it doesn't exist. When it's in the zoning code, you're legitimate. And then you can do things. You can make investments. You can maybe even get loans because you're complying. You're part of the system.
So that was a piece of structural capacity building.
That's right. And it was a systemic change, right? We got into the system and accommodated and acknowledged and I won't say validated, but I will say validated urban farming as a real thing.
So again, I'm trying to help our audience
Sure.
understand how to think systemically, and one of the lessons I've learned is to look at capacity building capacity. So there's structural capacity, that's laws, ordinances, governances. There's organizing, that's building coalitions. There's human capacity, that's knowledge. There's material capacity, that's money. And then there's political capacity, which never gets talked about, but is a big part of the story.
It's a lot of social capital, to be honest with you. And going back to that building coalition, you want to know, okay, who do I need to be at the table to? I don't know how to do this, right, necessarily. But I know what we're trying to do, and I know who I would need at the table to make it happen. And then you identify who doesn't want this to happen.
Right.
You got to, it's because you really want to say, okay,
know your foe.
Know your foes. And so you start with that, and then you start to assess what resources do we need and what options do we have for acquiring those resources. And if you just sort of narrow it down to asking, begging, requesting money, it may not happen. But if you then sort of the systems part is, there are other resources out there in the community. It may be volunteer. It could be there are a whole. So you really do take sort of that all-encompassing sort of view perspective. And then if something, what Bucky would always say, and I think this is maybe difficult, he says you start with universe.
Yeah.
And then you whittle down so that you don't inadvertently dismiss something that's relevant, but you're conscious about really, and let's face it, you start universe, you're going to whittle it down fairly fast, right? Because supernova are not going to factor into the urban farms, but you really then you get to this point where you're saying, okay, and then you start to make the dots and connect the systems.
And make sure that means when you think universally in terms of human capacity, that everybody's at the table.
Everybody's at the table, and everybody's opinion.
Poor, white, black, brown.
Because there's strength in diversity. I mean, that's nature, right? And
biodiversity.
It's biodiversity. And I actually would also point out that the Bucky system is basically, when Norman Cousins, Saturday Review, met Bucky one day was all excited, and Norman Cousins said, well, what are you so excited about, Bucky? He says, I've just discovered nature's coordinates. And Norman Cousins said, I think he did. His synergetic geometry is based on how he sees, he says nature is ultimate technology. And if you look at nature's strategy, and he could use all sorts of examples that he says, think about a tree limb and hundreds of pounds and with load on it and winds blowing, why doesn't it just break? And it's hydraulics. And then he sort of said the other principles. He said there are principles. Nature never pushes, nature almost always pulls, because materials are stronger in tension than they are in compression. So he said, think about how does a tree, using a tree analogy again, get water from the ground all the way up to every leaf and tip. It's evapotranspiration. It's pulling the water, right? And so over and over and over again, you can see that nature has the models. that if we could not mimic them, but use them as models for designing human support, then we're going to figure out how we can do more with less support, more people life support, without infringing upon each other and without undermining and without undermining ecological integrity.
That's wonderful, wonderful vision. So I'm now going to ask you a question I'm asking everybody, which is, what is your idea of a Green New Deal? What would that look like? What would be your priorities?
Well, I would start saying that there's been a lot of discussion. It seems to have been sort of an inside job a little bit. So my first thing would be we need to open it up a little bit and get input. Just even from the Bioneers this week, I've talked to people who said, we're doing things that could probably be of help, right, and support the Green New Deal. So and the other part for me that's really important is that we've got there are a lot of goals, there are a lot of targets of things we want to do. We've got to focus on it. There's the what and then there's the how. As you can, and I'm a how person, right? And figure out what that means. But I also think it's got to be a systems. We need to develop and put a systems lens around it. And I think because I'm listening to a lot of what's being proposed, and I think the tension, some of the tension is that it's broad in many respects in terms of what it covers. And in our roundtable yesterday, one of the concerns were, but maybe not deep enough on climate, broad in terms of other aspects. And they do all interact, but I think a more systems dynamic sort of view of it could start to uncover the strategies that would allow us to meet both of them. But I do think, I'm a firm believer that you've got to look at how you do become more inclusive. If you're going to build renewable energy technologies and infrastructure, then everybody's got to be included and benefit from that type of economic development. People of color, among others, who've been excluded in the past. So, no, we have to have those kind of conversations. But I think if we open it up a bit and had more input from folks who've had experiences about things, as you put it, what's worked and what hasn't worked, then we're going to cut a lot of time and a lot of frustration.
Here's a problem, which is that what you're proposing requires that people think long-term.
Yes.
Number one. Our government is not structurally sometimes capable of doing that, it seems. So how do we deal with that political bottleneck? What's your...
Here's where I think in some cases the nonprofit world, the NGOs haven't played enough of a role. I think, and one of the things is there's no coordination. I mean, they're grants or individual projects, but there could be a shadow government. I mean, I think to provide a little bit of, there's some other options out there. That's really what I want to do, among other things, with the World Game. Bucky Fuller, I haven't mentioned that yet, but this whole idea of a simulation that is a inclusive process that allows people to look at world problems and then play the game. A game is not intimidating. Your imagination can kind of not go
scenario planning.
It's scenario planning, but based on real data. See, current real data, scenario planning, and the only rules are meet your needs, the needs of your region and the needs of your country, but you get extra points if you do it cooperatively and collaboratively.
Beautiful.
So it just forces you to shift your perspective a little bit and say, well, what if I did that? And then I think that's where you start to discover some synergies that we have to, by the way, because even as we talk about more renewables, whether it's wind energy and they're growing, and solar energy, but remember, they're dependent upon resources that are distributed around the world. We don't have, right? There's much discussion about the rare earths and other minerals that are in the Congo and other places. And,
right.
And so we can't just say, let's just build them. We've got to think, what does it mean to build them and who has to be involved?
That's terrific. Greg Watson, thank you so much for being with us. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you very much. I have to.
Very illuminating.
Thank you. Thanks
Take
very
care.